We're here with Roger Hiorns in North West London to talk about his exhibition at Ikon in Birmingham and various ongoing projects.
The studio is based in a housing estate in central London, just to the edges of St John's Wood. And it's a famous building, and it finds itself in films quite often. It's always being filmed and it's always being photographed. And so every day you would sort of find yourself amongst some other sort of event, some event happening, some kind of media event, some kind of film event. And also, as well as it's a housing estate, it's full of people. And so this is a studio which I took over probably about 5 or 6 years ago because I live here. But I also have been making work that has been mostly focused around sort of the human and thinking about being and thinking about the body while I've been in this particular studio. There's a studio across town which is a slightly sort of larger, more industrial for work which is, I suppose, less precious. But this studio in particular has a sort of a locality, a sort of an ease for me to get to, and so it actually allows me to think about things rather quickly. The studio itself sort of allows, the idea of the being to come into the studio, because I guess in a way I'm surrounded by beings, I'm surrounded by humans, and so there is that sort of feeling that I'm part of a landscape which is occupied by humans. And I suppose part of the way that I used to describe the work, probably bit of I don't know, it was a sort of a catchphrase at some point, but it was always about sort of putting the human back into the center of an artwork, thinking about an artist's practice being solely about sort of the focusing on being, how we're supposed to behave perhaps, the future of how we're supposed to think about how the body might be. And so in a way for me at the moment I'm thinking about a number of shows and I'm thinking about a number of works. And it's been an interesting cycle, maybe the last 4 years, which has sort of included for instance, the burying of aircraft, but also a show I did at the Hayward recently last year, which was about variant CJD, a very nasty disease for degenerative disease that humans can get. And then sort of from there also there is the idea of actually trying to make bodies, thinking about how the human and how the body occupies space. And so at the moment this studio has been really sort of predominantly focused on the idea about how to redesign the body, how to think about how the body might sort of occupy the world as it is now. There's a sort of an idea about taking a stand on being. So there's this idea that the body or us or the human in the current state of the world has to take a stand, has to sort of allow themselves to become a kind of an autonomous kind of occupation somehow, that you're stepping back from the world, a kind of attuneness to the world. And so in a way I'm trying to sort of focus on the idea of bodies becoming attuned, the idea that we can actually have a group of bodies which are thinking about or kind of going through the process of becoming attuned, becoming aware of the presentness of the world, and then actually moving into the future somehow with a little bit more self-awareness perhaps. And so the Ikon show, which is sort of coming up at the moment, the Ikon show is about that. It's about sort of all of these different sort of variants of body. So variant CJD comes into the subject of the show. So there is a number of placards from the protest groups which are still protesting about a sort of an unravelling of truth from the government about what really did happen. So I'm sort of encouraged to show a number of these protest banners within the show. There are these falling body works. There are essentially these sort of bodies which have been found, which are used, which were from mostly the film industry, which are designed specifically to fall in a specific way, or designed to be props that fall, so the body in motion. And I was very interested in acquiring some of these sort of articulated sort of figures. Some of them made of silicon, some of them look very much like figures, some of them uncannily so, and then some of them are actually more sort of fiberglass articulations. And so one of them, for instance, which was shown in America recently, has the body is stuffed with sort of a text by Heidegger. And then another one is a body which has a small amount of brain matter sort of secreted into the body itself. And so you have these sort of material relations, and you have these ideas of relations. But you also have this idea that sort of everything can become a little bit too overwhelming. You've got these bodies which are hanging on a wall which then fall. And so the act of falling becomes a very sort of significant part of the activity of a body falling, but also of a unique work which is actually just dealing with a simple idea of a body simply moving from a state of being supported into collapse. And then you have that extra layer, you have this sort of Heidegger text, and then you have this brain matter. And so in a way, I'm sort of wanting to overweight the work. And I think at the moment what I'm really interested in, and it comes into mind when I'm thinking about literal ideas, this over-literal idea like burying an aircraft, for instance, is that there is a sort of an overwhelming weight to them. There's a sort of overwhelming breakage to sort of overlayering cliches, perhaps. Sort of taking things a little bit further than the world is currently allowing them to do. And so if you take these actions further, that perhaps some kind of rip, some breakage, some kind of tension will be sort of broken somehow, and that we can maybe think about sort of behaviours in the future. And I suppose in a way what interests me in the studio is that art is not as so much about sort of making, it's not so much about providing objects in the world, even though sort of making an object I think is probably quite a radical act these days. And becomes interesting again to think about sculpture, and it's interesting again to think about sort of object making. But that's a different subject in a way. But it also becomes about sort of thinking about how to behave. And so in a way, artists are sort of interesting. They sort of allow the possibility of new behaviours to sort of exist. And so in a way, it's not so much about designing artworks in a studio, it's more about sort of designing behaviour. And so I think it's fascinating to grab the texture or the surfaces of the world, to grab the idea that the world is these rather sort of unique interlocking surfaces which all kind of that all seem to intertwine with each other, but you know, we don't necessarily have to go deep into these surfaces, that we can skate rather seamlessly from surface to surface. I think it's up to the artist, or up to a kind of an idea of taking a stand, which is about the idea of ripping through those surfaces and seeing what might be below, what might be underneath. And I suppose that's the thing I've been mostly fascinated with in the studio over the last 4 years. And I suppose going back to variant CJD, that was very much a subject matter which was very interesting for me. It's about sort of the exploration or excavation of information. It's about the presentation of information in a gallery space. It's about sort of a subject matter which people felt was problematic, disturbing. People didn't really want to engage. I think that people are slightly obsessed by thinking about the safety or the kind of risk averse of their mentality or their kind of psyches these days. And so in a way, this work was a kind of a challenge to that. It was about the fact that the mind had nowhere to hide to some degree, that you were confronted with essentially a sort of a worldly truth, that you could divulge or divest your time within this worldly truth and look into it as deeply as you wanted to. And so some people would take hours upon hours reading this rather sort of difficult, problematic material. And then some others would probably spend 10 minutes and then decide that it wasn't for them. And so in a way that sort of describes, or a self-description of how you really want your mind to work in the world. And I think that working from variant CJD and talking about sort of psychological fractures, but also talking about tearing, we can then sort of link things like burying aircraft. We can say that we're sort of excavating the skin of the world somehow, and we're putting a worldly object again inside the skin of the world. We're sort of burying an aircraft, and then we're making that aircraft available to go into again. And so there is this sort of layering of anxiety. There's this layering of experience, that you put an aircraft under the ground. It's an object of dominance in the world. It sort of changes our reality from place to place. It sort of offers us an idea of travel. It offers us an idea of new reality. We get on at Heathrow and we get off in Rio. You know, that's a shift in reality which I find really fascinating. And so to actually take this object and maybe insult it is maybe the next stage of this object. It's sort of, you know, what is the next stage of an airplane? What's the next stage of aircraft, passenger aircraft? And what's the next stage of travel? You know, what's the next stage of this sort of idea of moving from one continent to the other, which we do so seamlessly now. And so it becomes all of these layers of possibility, these propositions. And then we bury it. And then we have people go inside it, and we have people thinking about how to occupy the space. You know, do they want to sit there for hours? Do they want to sit there for 10 minutes? Do they feel anxious? Do they feel claustrophobic? And so you have all these, again, these weighting kind of layers of anxiousness that might sort of somehow create some kind of reality, a new reality perhaps, a new way of behaving.
You've spoken about not just creating objects, but also creating behaviours. And
Yes.
elsewhere, previously, you've spoken about creating contexts, because the object doesn't really exist without the context. But I was interested in the fact that Seizure, which obviously your kind of iconic work you're very well known for, got taken out of its context and preserved elsewhere. So how do you feel about that? I mean, it's taken on a whole new life in a very, very different location.
That was interesting. And I know, it was something that I did say quite recently, I think, which was that yes, and I say it all the time, and when I was teaching, or lecturing at least, it was always something which I always sort of enjoyed sort of telling people, which was to, that it wasn't enough to make an artwork. It wasn't enough just to simply put an artwork in the world. You had to think about actually redesigning the world around the artwork, you know, to allow the artwork to have kind of a purer or more efficient or an effective relationship to the world. You actually also had to take on the fabric of the surroundings of the artwork. And so that could be the systems of the art world, perhaps, that it was being shown in, or that could be, you know, the authorities that were going to be pushing against this object. It could simply be just about how to separate the artwork from the world in an interesting way. But it was always something about, again, thinking about sort of adapting the world and the artwork rather than just simply making artworks. I think that it's fascinating to go back to Seizure, because Seizure was very contextual. It was about a bedsit, a council house bedsit, and that was sort of the desire for the work to be built within. And so searching for a bedsit, searching for the right scale, right size, you know, everything sort of fell into place with that place at Elephant and Castle. And so the process, the making, the factory that needed to exist to actually make Seizure was all placed very much, and so the context and the density of the work was all very present at Harper Road. And then, yeah, people visited it, people had an experience, and that experience was then very subjective. People would tell me about what they thought, what they felt, and some people had quite profound relations with the work. Some people felt very religious, which is kind of interesting. And so it was sort of very interesting to sort of kind of feel that people were wanting to share a kind of a subjective relationship to something which is essentially a synthetic object, you know, something that's made. And so I was quite hard at the time. I kind of pushed it aside. I just, you know, would just want to talk about, well, actually, I don't think I talked about the object very much at all. I don't think I talked very much about it. And at the moment, I'm also aware in this conversation that I'm also talking about the work as an object. But at the time, it was an installation. It was a part of the mapping of Elephant and Castle. So it became a kind of some kind of scar tissue on the surface of London. You know, some kind of description of something happening, something being kind of, something occurring. So 2 years of it being open, 2 years of people visiting it, people talking about it, it became sort of interesting to think about it in a different way. At the time I used the word violation a lot. I always thought it was very interesting for an artist to violate their own sort of sense of identity. I think that was really important, and I continue with that thought. It's not quite so hard-edged, but I find different ways of talking about it. But I think that if you start sort of feeling that you've established an identity, then that's probably actually quite, you know, you're kidding yourself to some degree. And I think it's always interesting to redevelop or rethink your relationship to the world. It's a fluctuation. It's not a stable thing. It's quite porous, and so you can have these ideas. And so I think it was a slightly beyond the pale idea at the time, which was essentially just to rip it out of the building, or to take the building away from it and to steal it. And so the work was essentially stolen. It was sort of taken away from its original context, its original memories, original kind of people's kind of affection. And I found that's really important and interesting. And I thought that this was useful, that it was actually more interesting to actually sort of try and destroy what people's affection of a work was somehow, or to steal it away from that. Because in a way, you know, that instability seems to sum things up. You know, that instability seems to be more truthful than actually just walking away with mythologies and sort of ideas about sort of, let's just talk about an artwork for the rest of our lives. I think it's also interesting that at the time when I was teaching, I think it was sort of interesting to talk about ideas with students, talk about what was existing on the planet and what wasn't. their relationship to the world was about objects and things, how to negotiate the world through how things exist still. Things are still present. So that's why objects are quite important now, is that they create values, but they also create power relations. Make an object or put an object in a room, there's an objective power relation that's established. And so actually to destroy or to take away an object which had certain amounts of power to it seemed actually counterintuitive and wrong-headed. And so no, it was quite a tough conversation, a number of conversations over a very protracted period of time, but it was great that there was a number of people who were very interested in this object sort of being retranslated essentially, having a different view. And then it became interesting that the Arts Council collection in particular was interested in it. There was the Tate and the Arts Council collection who were very interested in this thing kind of existing. And they were both very supportive. And so the Arts Council were quite happy to... the thing about the Arts Council is it's quite a nomadic collection. It doesn't really have a central place. And so for me that seemed actually perfectly fitting for the narrative, that you actually have a place, a storage essentially of a work, but that place, that work that I'm trying to steal essentially doesn't have a place. It doesn't exist in a single place. It's currently up in Yorkshire and they built a building for it, but that building is essentially a kind of a storage unit for that work. It's supposed to travel, it's supposed to move to other places. I'm not entirely sure if it'll make it, but it was something that was very important. It was very much stipulated that that was the case. So no, the work itself is sort of neither here nor there. It doesn't have a kind of a set reasoning. It's not an interior, but it is an object. And so I wanted to turn this installation into an object, and I wanted this object not really to have any kind of identity. And so it became kind of fascinating. It became kind of an interesting kind of process of moving one kind of idea or one state of an idea into another quite effectively. And so for me, it was kind of an interesting exercise. It's quite a big exercise. And then it sort of gets you onto Bristol. It kind of gets you onto thinking about sort of what's happening in Bristol, because in a way, Bristol is again another work within these last 4 years, which is about the figure. It's about sort of the idea of power relations, about materials being used as a kind of materials, form and objects being put in the way, put in the way of the world, and actually sort of creating a certain sort of power relationship again. And then you also have this figurativeness. You have these two dominant black forms. And I think that it's really interesting to put two dominant black forms in the centre of Bristol, for instance. That was also sort of part of the psychology of the work. But also as well is that we're talking about beings, that they're essentially these beings that are essentially furnaces. So they're sort of these sort of furnaces which are sort of burning inside, you know, that they have a heat, or they can be provided heat. They're granite forms, 7 meters tall. And so the weight, the density, the making of it, all of it is so unusual, almost Egyptian. And we have this sort of monumentality. We have this sort of mouths. These mouths are kind of sexualized in a way for the furnaces. They're where the belly would be, but they're also where the genitals would be on a figure. So you have this idea that the genitals or the mouth or the bellies of these works are sort of burning somehow. The work itself is not a protest, but it is a kind of, again, a drawing attention to the landscape that they're set within. That sort of corporate landscape, which is easily washdownable, overly sort of surveilled, and, you know, with a fair amount of security. You know, it's a landscape which is about sort of making money. It's a corporate landscape, a corporatism. And so the free tank, the space that we were given, was a piece of Bristol, not this corporate landscape. It's the area which it was an area which people were free, essentially, to go down to the water's edge to fetch water. And so the houses, the industries would all fetch water through this space. So essentially the space has been left. It's been this strange anomalous space has been left to be its own thing. Some insertions of concrete, some rather beautiful bits of concrete, and there's some interesting bits. There's a stairwell for people to actually, again, feel that they can go down to the water's edge. And then you've got these strange sculptures, these strange kind of rather sort of brutish kind of things kind of hanging around. And so the work itself is this sort of multi-layering. It's about a sort of taking a stand again. It's talking about sort of power. But it's a sort of a power in which, you know, that these things are autonomous. It's sort of like an autonomy. I'm always very critical about putting artworks in the public realm, outside of the museum. It has to be done in an interesting and challenging way. It has to be done, not even in a challenging way, it has to be done right. It has to be done in an interesting way. It has to be kind of essential. And so you do get sculptors who make things that go outside, and that's not me, it's kind of something else. This is just something that needed to exist outside because it just seemed more interesting than being inside. That the contextualization seems to work. I guess, in a way, what interests me is that there is a kind of no set way of doing things now. There is no established rules, and the borders are very, very weak. And I think that actually that was the one thing that I would ever say to a student if I was to meet one these days, was to say that, yeah, enjoy yourself. You know, it's all to play for. There is a weakness that can be prodded, and then you'll start winning, and it becomes interesting. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, I think.